your show, F is for Family, I relate to it because it's about parenting in the 70s, and that's, you know, that was when I was parented like you. What do you think of parents now? How do you compare them to parents in the 70s?
Oh, it's just completely, the kids have so much power. It's like ridiculous. Like half of these kids, I'm like, I look and I just have what happened to me. And I'm like looking at a kid and be like, this kid's about ready to get punted across the grocery store. And it just never happens.
Right.
They just don't get hit. And I think it's hurting this country.
You're mad. Wait a minute.
No, like...
Let's get this. You're mad that children are not being hit.
This should be the threat of it. Half of it was just that, look, it was just your dad was acting like he was going to do it. He never did it, but your mother did. And because she was a woman, it was like, okay. Because it was like, hey, you know, you let a girl beat you up, you know, you kind of felt emasculated.
Yeah.
We had a rule, like, actually, a lot of the stuff that I look at from when I was a kid that actually kind of made sense in a way would now be considered like abuse, I guess. Like, when I was a kid, if you didn't finish your supper, as we called it.
Supper, yeah.
Yeah, my mother was just like, well, you're going to finish, she would just wrap it in cellophane, and you just picked up where you left off for breakfast, like a blue-collar job. Like, you take the shovel out of the hole and just start digging it again. So, yeah, I remember one night we had cube steaks, which is like one of the toughest pieces of meat. I don't know if you guys, everything's so like Asian-infused Wagyu beef. Everybody's eating that crap now. But cube steak was like, literally had to hit it with a hammer to make it like edible. And so we were having cube steaks. And I forget, my little brother was still in a high chair and he couldn't finish his. So my mother goes, all right, we're just gonna have to eat it for breakfast. And that was like 8 hours away, which was like half his life. So he was like, all right, I'll take that deal. So the next morning, I remember we were having waffles. My mother always made Sunday breakfast. So we had all these waffles, eggs, bacon, this whole layout. My brother was looking at half-eaten cube steaks and a little mound of green bean casserole. And he goes, so he looked at my mom, he goes, Mom, can I have a waffle? And she goes, no, you gotta finish your supper. He's like, well, after I finish my supper, then can I have a waffle? She goes, no, that is your breakfast. And he goes, oh, Mom, I hate you. And my dad, without looking up, took a full glass of milk and threw it in his face. Swear to God. This is what kills me. What kills me...
You want everyone today to have as miserable a childhood as you had.
No, but it was kind of funny. We know what's hilarious was my mother just popped up and just immediately started cleaning up, and my dad just kept eating. Like, he didn't, like... No, like, the roles were defined back then. Now, the guy has to throw the milk, he has to clean it up while telling his wife she's brave for just sitting there. Like, whatever that is. Can you hear it? Oh, I know. Women are so overrated, right? We went from... We went from not listening to them to now it's you know, it's ridiculous. Like that believe women. It's like all of them. How about 85%? I'll give you 87%, all right? But that last 13% that keys your car, lights your on fire, and puts a family pet in a pot of stew.
Who put a pet in a pot of stew?
Glenn Close.
Oh,
that's Close, yeah.
That's, yeah, okay, all right. I think it was a separately boiled.
You know what I miss, yeah, tougher parenting and evidence. Those are the things that I miss from my childhood.
Evidence?
Yeah.
You mean
due process?
Right.
Somebody says something happened, and then someone else goes, well, I said it happened this way, like the old Gumshoe shows. Then they had to figure it out.
Right.
Yeah, that doesn't exist now on social media. It's just like, it's just frontier justice.
Right.
You feel how nervous everybody just got in here? The fact that I just suggested that there should be due process? This guy's talking crazy, man. Did he just join ISIS? Yeah. This is what it is.
What I'm saying...
And then the woos that they agreed, but they didn't agree when it counted.
We'll digitally add woos, don't worry. We have the woo machine. You are way too angry. 50 is still relatively young. You have the anger of a 110-year-old man. All these telephones!
I can't argue.
The legal devaluation of men's lives is a largely unacknowledged, appalling human rights abuse, and it's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. In October of 2017, just as the Me Too movement was revving up to near universal praise as a necessary corrective on behalf of female sexual assault and harassment victims, a 26-year-old British woman named Rebecca Palmer was found guilty of 4 counts of perverting the course of justice. In an unusual decision, unusual because it was just, she was sentenced to 5 years in prison for repeated false allegations of rape against a then 20-year-old British soldier. Palmer had had an affair with the man, and after he broke it off, she had begun an attempt to ruin his life by telling police that he raped her. Her campaign of lies led to the man's being arrested more than once and held in jail on various occasions. The fact that this woman will serve time in prison is quite remarkable and well-deserved. But the Wiltshire police rep's statement to the press is amazing and all too familiar to those of us who follow these kinds of cases. Here's the police rep's predictable comment. Quote, Palmer became completely embroiled in her own web of lies, and her appalling behavior could really have a negative impact on other victims of rape or sexual assault who may choose not to report it to police for fear that they will not be believed. End quote. This is the classic feminist response in which the real victim of Rebecca Palmer's numerous false allegations is seen to be other women, even though no real women were harmed by Palmer. The man whose character was publicly dragged through the mud for 2 years, who received multiple police visits, who sweated behind bars, who foresaw his whole life permanently ruined, who dreaded years of incarceration, who had to defend himself against the claims of a determined accuser in an era in which we are continually exhorted to believe accusing women. This man's years-long mental and emotional suffering is of less consequence to the police rep and to the journalist covering the story than the potential hesitation of a hypothetical victim or victims. Welcome to the upside-down world of feminist culture in which ideologues have been so successful in spreading their propaganda that the average man and woman on the street will still tell you that it's a man's world, and that women are discriminated against even when the case in question is about a male victim. This is a world in which men account for well over 90% of the prison population, and in which women's crimes, including murder, are consistently treated with remarkable leniency. Being a man in our era means knowing that you can go to prison for the rest of your life on the uncorroborated molestation claims of a teenage girl, and even if your accuser recants her entire story, the criminal justice system may well keep you in prison, and there won't be a public outcry because we're a culture that's inclined to believe men are guilty. Take the terrifying case of a Colorado man named Charles Farrar, who was sentenced back in 2002 to 145 years in prison based solely on the testimony of his rebellious stepdaughter, Sasha, who claimed he had molested and sexually abused her for years from age 11 to 15. The girl alleged that Farrar had assaulted her hundreds of times and had filmed his abuse of her. The police never did find any film, barely interviewed the girl, and failed to interview many witnesses who could have contradicted her story. Yet, still, the prosecution went ahead and the jury convicted Farrar. Just a few months after that conviction, the then 18-year-old Sasha took back her allegations, saying she'd fabricated the whole thing because she wanted to live with her grandparents in Oklahoma. She even confessed that she'd told one of the prosecutors in the case that it was all a lie on the morning of the trial. But no matter. Multiple judges have upheld Farrar's conviction, and he remains in prison to this day, awaiting an appeal for a crime he and his former accuser insist never happened. Yet feminists tell us with a straight face that in cases of sexual assault allegations, we should start by believing the alleged female victim. And of course, it doesn't work the other way round in cases where adolescent boys are raped by their female teacher. Even if the abuse continued for months or years, even if the evidence is rock solid, even if the teacher admits she did it, she will likely be given a slap on the wrist. Earlier this month, May of 2018, a 32-year-old California high school teacher named Samantha Chiotta pleaded guilty to 3 counts of unlawful intercourse with a minor boy. Details about her crime are vague, but it seems that the teacher victimized more than one of her grade 9 male students, giving them alcohol and sexually abusing them at her home, but still managed to work out a lenient plea deal involving 4 years probation. Not a day in jail. She will not register as a sex offender, and she may even be able to reapply to teach school when her probationary sentence is concluded. Though the victim's grandmother is furious, saying she complained to the school about the ongoing abuse and nothing was done about it by the female school principal, Chiotta herself seems to think that she has been the victim in the case. In the statement accompanying her plea deal, she did not apologize and did not take responsibility for her crime, but spoke instead of the, quote, long journey that she had ahead of her, saying that although she had not had a chance to tell her side of the story, she would, quote, take what has happened and use the experiences and lessons learned to give back to the community, end quote. In a culture overwhelmingly inclined to see women as innocent, even convicted female sex offenders are allowed to represent themselves as noble victims. Our society has so much sympathy for women, in fact, that it even extends to female murderers. If a woman beats her boyfriend to death in a horrific planned murder, she will probably be able to claim some sort of mental distress as a way of avoiding conviction, likely citing fear of the man to justify her violence. And if she is found not guilty, the case will attract next to no attention because our society doesn't care about men who are beaten to death by women. We figure they must have done something to deserve it. Earlier this year, January of 2018, 32-year-old Ann Norris was found not criminally responsible for the murder of Marcel Reardon in St. John's, Newfoundland. Now, a verdict of not criminally responsible is said to apply in cases where the defendant is unable to appreciate the consequences of their actions, or unable to know right from wrong, or not in control of their behavior. Ann Norris was sufficiently in control of her behavior to purchase, the day previous to the murder, the hammer that she planned to use to bludgeon Marcel, hitting him so many times in the head that the coroner couldn't tell how many blows there were. And she knew enough about the wrongness of her action to dispose of his body outside her apartment and to throw the hammer into St. John's Harbor in order to hide the evidence. But jurors were responsive to claims that Norris suffers from bipolar disorder, and that was enough to get her off. Even the prosecutor in the case expressed sympathy for Norris, saying at the conclusion of the trial that, quote, these are difficult issues with no easy answers, end quote. A man is dead, but that's just a detail in the woman's story of psychological difficulty. No space in the report of the trial was given to personalizing the dead man or to representing the grief and loss of his family and friends. In the reports of all these cases, and so many more, there is a consistent diminishment of the humanity of the men involved and a corresponding enhancement of the humanity of the women, such that we are encouraged to imagine the feelings of female perpetrators while we are discouraged from imagining the feelings of the male victims. Whether they are falsely accused, sexually abused, jailed, or dead, the personhood of the men involved is airbrushed out of the picture so that it's difficult to identify with them at all. Being male in a feminist culture means knowing that your life is worth less than a woman's life. That's why I published Sons of Feminism, Men Have Their Say, a book that gives voice to men's experiences, telling what it feels like to be belittled, disliked, dismissed, blamed, falsely accused, and discriminated against under law, all while being expected to apologize for male privilege. The book is dedicated to all the innocent men who have suffered in our gynocentric and feminist society. Are men's problems mainly personal and self-created, while women's problems are caused by men and male-dominated culture? And is it worse to be propositioned at a mathematics conference than to be told by your entire culture that your sexuality is sick and violent? And how did we get to the point where the relatively trivial problems of one sex can entirely obliterate the problems of another? That's my subject on today's Fiamengo file. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. This is the last video of our second season. Steve and I are going to be taking a short break and will resume later in the summer. A while back, one of my Facebook friends alerted me to a December 2014 blog post by an MIT computer science professor named Scott Aronson. It described the loneliness, confusion, and self-hatred Aronson had experienced as a self-described young math nerd, and the bitterness of being told by a feminist culture over and over again about his privilege as a man. The post is a must-read for anybody who cares about the male half of society and the lack of fit between feminist theory and so many men's lives. Among other things, Aronson explains his experience of his sexuality was a source of unceasing humiliation and torment. Quote, he says, I spent my formative years, basically from the age of 12 until my mid-20s, feeling not entitled, not privileged, but terrified. I was terrified that one of my female classmates would somehow find out that I sexually desired her, and that the instant she did, I would be scorned, laughed at, called a creep and a weirdo, maybe even expelled from school or sent to prison. And furthermore, that the people who did these things to me would somehow be morally right to do them, even if I couldn't understand how. He goes on. You can call that my personal psychological problem if you want, but it was strongly reinforced by everything I picked up from my environment. To take one example, the sexual assault prevention workshops we had to attend regularly as undergrads, with their endless lists of all the forms of human interaction that might be sexual harassment or assault, and their refusal ever to specify anything that definitely wouldn't be sexual harassment or assault. I left each of those workshops with enough fresh paranoia and self-hatred to last me through another year, end quote. The whole post is insightful and funny and sad, not only describing Aronson's pain in feeling ugly and unwanted, but also the depressing conviction that he deserved to be unwanted. And nobody cared about his experience. There were no professors researching it or activists protesting it, no panels convened to discuss it, no government committees reporting on measures to alleviate it, no task forces to prevent further suffering, no poster campaigns to alert the public, no government money spent on helping victims. He was alone. He described in compelling detail how as a young man he begged a doctor to give him some kind of medication to have his sexual drive eliminated, how he thought often about suicide, and how the only thing that saved him was his love of mathematics. Eventually, success in mathematics enabled him to gain the confidence to be different in the world, to meet women, and eventually to marry and have a child, which transformed his life. But in the course of his struggle, it was understandably difficult for him to keep believing in feminist claims about the system of male power and female powerlessness. He tells us this, quote, "Now the whole time I was struggling with this, I was also fighting a second battle to maintain the liberal, enlightened feminist ideals that I had held since childhood against a powerful current pulling me away from them. I reminded myself every day that there's no conspiracy to make the world a hell for shy male nerds. There are only individual women and men trying to play the cards they're dealt, and the confluence of their interests sometimes leads to crappy outcomes. No woman owes male nerds anything. No woman deserves blame if she prefers the Neanderthals. Everyone's free choice demands respect," end quote. In the end, according to Aronson, he did manage to maintain his feminist ideals. He states now his commitment to encouraging girls to go into science, his support for affirmative action hiring, and his horror at the supposedly typical and widespread female experience of sexual assault and harassment. But Aronson continues to bristle at the generally accepted idea of male privilege. It simply isn't so, he argued in the Post. Men, too, can be victims of sexism, and the vast majority of ordinary, non-alpha men are not privileged at all. Well, not surprisingly, his post stirred up a hornet's nest of opposition and angry denunciation. Feminists objected not only that a man would put his pain in words in order to contradict the theory of male privilege, how dare he, but also that he would seem to put at least part of the blame on feminism itself, the sacred not-to-be-contradicted equality movement, for some of the difficulties he had experienced. The general opinion was, well, maybe he'd been miserable, but he had only himself to blame. He couldn't legitimately blame a larger society in the way women always can. So what if he had to attend some sexual assault prevention programs? Well, women have to get raped. I have to admit I didn't read most of the feminist attacks on Aronson. I just couldn't bear it. But I did read Arthur Chu's nominally sympathetic piece in Salon magazine called The Plight of the Bitter Nerd, in which a self-proclaimed fellow nerd comes forward to teach Scott Aronson all about women's suffering that he hadn't apparently understood. According to Chu, although Scott's suffering was real, it was a self-imposed suffering, almost entirely caused by ideas inside his own head, while women's suffering, on the other hand, is not only real, but also externally imposed, as we see demonstrated in the claims of a woman named Amy, who responded to Scott's blog, telling him how she'd been sexually harassed and ultimately assaulted by shy nerds. So there, shy nerds couldn't be let off the hook. The Salon writer's main point in the article is that men had better get used to the fact that there is a qualitative difference between their pain and that of women. He sums it up as follows, quote, "Scott's story is about things that happened inside his brain. Amy's story is about actual things that were done to her by other people against her will, without her control," end quote. Well, that's a rhetorically neat opposition, even if it is obviously wrong. It leaves out the fact that men are harassed and sexually assaulted too, that men are the victims of violence far more often than women are, that men's depression is real enough to cause disproportionately higher incidents of male suicide, and that feminist culture telling Scott he's dirty and disgusting is palpably real, not something he made up in his head. But none of that matters to Mr. Chu, whose feminist blinkers were firmly in place. It's not at all surprising that Aronson's lament would fall on the deaf ears of ideologues who refuse to acknowledge the male victims of our gynocentric culture. But some non-ideologues did hear Aronson's story and were moved by it. And perhaps more importantly, other men read his post and were comforted and could believe that they might live through their personal hells and come out the other side. Stories like Scott's have had a huge impact on me too. When I gave my first public lecture at the University of Toronto 3 years ago, I had a pretty good idea about the, in my opinion, belligerent SJW opposition that would cry foul. And true to form, they staged a protest of hysterical dimensions and pulled the fire alarm to try to prevent my evil words from polluting the minds of the young.
Academic feminism, as it is practiced and disseminated in our universities, is overwhelmingly intellectually empty, incoherent, and dishonest. Its whole reason for being depends on an activist orientation towards women's position in society.
But at that time, I had little idea who I was speaking for, the young men and the not so young men who had come to recognize that their society cared a lot more about women than it did about them. In the months that followed the talk, I received a lot of emails from these men telling me about their lives, especially their sense of being blamed for everything and the concrete injustices they had experienced. Here are just a few examples. The first is from an email from a man who wrote me after my talk at Queen's University in 2014 about being a male student. This is what he says. Quote, I was born in 1988, and my experience at school was that at every level of education there was outreach for girls and both explicit and implicit understandings that girls were to be treated with respect and sensitivity. This doctrine was never extended to the boys. The impression that this gave me, and all boys I'm sure, was that girls were the victims of some form of bias or prejudice that we, the boys, were not to encourage or repeat. I think it is all but impossible for a child to realize the way he internalizes that message and assumes that his own problems and inadequacies are his own fault and unimportant, especially since we were never aware what misdeed against girls we were supposed to ameliorate. The grievances of past generations never answered the question of why we were to give our female peers more respect than we were allowed to give ourselves, end quote. And he goes on to describe what he calls the, quote, toxic and shame-inducing experience of having female teachers make it clear that they preferred female students to male students and that they had contempt for the male part of humanity. Here's a story from somebody at the other end of the life spectrum looking back on divorce and losing contact with his son. Quote, he tells us, 45 years ago, I had to sit in a police counselor's office while she and my ex-wife told me that my son was being taken out of the state, where I could never see him without great difficulty and hardship, against my wishes, and that there was nothing I could do about it. I've seen him twice since then. He didn't look good either time. Now I don't know where he is, how he is, or even if he's still alive. Every day I burn with a furious passion about the injustice that's been done to my son, to me, and to millions of men and their children under the oppression of feminism. Because I know how I feel, I know how those other men feel. Just under the surface in every one of them burns that same furious passion, and it's past the point of negotiating away or counseling away, end quote. A third example involves someone I came to know in Ottawa who returned home from a trip abroad to discover that his wife had thrown a bunch of his clothes and belongings into his car, telling him she was divorcing him. When he tried to enter their home, she called the police, saying she feared for her life because her husband was a controlling man and a gun enthusiast. In fact, he was a collector of heirloom, non-functional firearms. But following the feminist script, the police informed my friend that he had to stay away from his wife and their children, that if he went into his own home, he would be charged with trespassing. Through the long divorce proceedings, which led my friend deeply into debt and caused such stress that he lost his job, his ex-wife told lies about her fear of him and deliberately alienated his children, whom he has now not seen for over 10 years. Nearly $500,000 in debt and unable to work due to physical and emotional disabilities, my friend is convinced that his life will never recover. But his story, as I've learned, is absolutely ordinary. Over the years, I realized that these stories weren't just for me, that they deserved to be read by a wider public. And so I got the idea for a book. I decided to call the book Sons of Feminism in order to emphasize the centrality of the feminist revolution in changing the lives of men today in negative ways. If you have a story you want to tell, please consider contributing a 3,000 to 5,000 word personal essay to this book. I want readers to understand what it means to grow up male in a post-feminist world that actively denies the reality or significance of male suffering. Details about the book will be posted on the StudioBrule site. Male pain isn't only about things guys make up in their heads, as the Salon magazine article outrageously declared. Male pain is real, and it's totally unacceptable. And what I became especially upset about was the what I came to see as the really negative environment for young men at university, because I began thinking about what it must feel like to sit there day after day after day, hearing about how all the good things in the world are the contribution of women and all the bad things are the contribution of men, and how what young men have to do today is basically just take a step back, step away from the power, as Professor Susanna Walters said in that Washington Post piece, Why Can't We Hate Men? You know, that's what you have to do as a man. You have to bear the weight of centuries of male privilege and oppressive behavior. And so you just have to step back, don't run for office, don't do anything. I mean, you know, as if, I mean, it's unbelievable.
Bow forever,
yeah,
basically.
Basically, yeah, and you know, be abject, apologize for your so-called privilege, and let your sisters come forward and make the world a better place. And that is, I mean, that it's so crude and so ridiculous, but I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that that is the message that most young men are getting at university today. That the only way to be a good man is to focus all of your energy and attention on someone else, whether it's you know, on helping women or on helping the indigenous or whatever it happens to be. That you can't have your own concerns, you can't have your own needs, and you certainly can't have your own problems or issues. That's the only way you can be a good person. So yeah, it just seemed to me outrageous, and I kept waiting for other people like to say something about it. And I would occasionally talk to others about it, and they'd say, oh, yeah, they could sort of see, but they, you know, they weren't willing to stick their necks out in any way. And so finally, I just got to the point where I thought, well, I should do it then.
Isn't that a weird position to be in? Because I do find so many of the people that I've talked to that have had similar evolutions to you, they don't think of themselves as particularly brave or particularly like, oh, well, I was the one that wanted to save the world or anything, but you get pushed to a point where then finally you're at that ledge, and it's either they're going to push you over and you'll never speak again and you'll disappear, or you kind of turn around and fight back.
Yeah, I mean, in my case, it's not that because I do get a rush out of conflict and that sort of thing, but for this particular issue, I don't think I'm very good at it. I mean, for one thing, it's very difficult to be on the other side of a social justice issue, because to be on the right side, the left side,
Right.
yeah, the correct side, I should say, the left side, it's easy because you hear the arguments over and over again. So you just have to open your mouth and out they all come. And usually people are stunned into embarrassed silence as soon as you start attacking them with your various claims and your various charges against them. But to be able to argue really effectively on the other side, you not only have to know all the left side arguments, but then you have to research all these things that you'd been taught were simply not true, or were unthinkable, or were impossible. And yeah, it's not my area of expertise, certainly. My area of expertise is literature, but and I don't think I'm very good. Like, you have to be good in debate and answering people's challenging questions, and I hate all that. I'm terrible at that. So if there were
a fine mess you've gotten yourself into.
Yeah. So, and I didn't really, and I didn't entirely understand what it would be like when I gave my first couple of talks, and they were protested, and they pulled the fire alarms, and there were a lot of really angry students in the audience. I really had no idea that it was going to be like that. I thought it was just I was sort of going to talk about academic feminism in a sort of bounded way. And I knew that because I'd studied it for years. But I didn't realize I was going to be asked to answer questions about, everything to do with the relations between men and women, and rape, and all of these big issues. So I didn't do a very good job, I didn't think, but nobody else is doing it, and so I want to keep on. And then I started doing my video series 3 years ago, and that has given me a lot of satisfaction, actually, because, well, as soon as I started speaking in public, I got a lot of emails, an incredible number of emails, mostly from young men, some from men not that young, talking about their experiences. And it blew me away, and I know Jordan's talked about this too, but the amount of pain that there is out there, the number of young men who just want to, they love women in most cases. They want to have a happy relationship. They've never intended to hurt or oppress anyone, and yet they're told that even without intending to, they do, just by looking at a young woman, or asking her out on a date. They're doing some sort of violence. And the pain that has caused, and the uncertainty and the confusion and the resentment as well. It's, and some of these young men have themselves been abused. Their parents, sometimes their mothers, have been abusive, or girlfriends. And yet they're they have to hear over and over again about how it's only men who are ever abusive. And yeah, it's amazing to me. Like, once you go down the rabbit hole or whatever it is, and you see our culture from the other side, and every time you turn on the news, there's yet another story about, whatever, the terrible problem of catcalling, and how it represents, the deep misogyny of North American culture, and what needs to be done about it, and, all that kind of thing. Yeah, it's astounding. So now I sort of feel like, with my videos anyway, that my role is to at least to say to young men that you're not crazy. Our culture is actually crazy.